The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. Chapter 1. Voice of Reasoning. She came to him toward morning. She entered very carefully, moving silently, floating through the chamber like a phantom. The only sound was that of her mantle brushing her naked skin. Yet this faint sound was enough to wake the Witcher, or maybe it only tore him from the half-slumber in which she rocked monotonously, as though traveling through fathomless depths suspended between the seabed and its calm surface amid gentle, undultering stands of seaweed. He did not move, did not stir. The girl filtered closer, threw off her mantle, and slowly, hesitantly, rested on her knee on the edge of the large bed. He observed her through lowered lashes, still not betraying his wakefulness. The girl carefully climbed onto the bedclothes and onto him, wrapping her thighs around him. Leaning forward on straining arms, she brushed his face with hair which smelled of chamomile. Determined and as if impatient, she leaned over and touched his eyelids, cheeks, lips with the tips of her breast. He smiled very slowly, delicately grasping her by the shoulders, and she straightened, escaping his fingers. She was radiant, luminous in the misty brilliance of dawn. He moved, but with the pressure from both hands. She forbade him to change position, and, with a light but decisive movement of her hips, demanded a response. He responded. She no longer backed away from his hands. She threw back her head, shook her hair. Her skin was cool and surprisingly smooth. Her eyes glistened when her face came closer to his, were huge and dark as the eyes of a water nymph. Rocked, he sank into a sea of chamomile, and as it grew agitated and seethed. The Witcher. Later, it said the man came from the north, from Rope's Gate. He came on foot, leading his laden horse by the bridle. It was late afternoon, and the ropers, saddlers, and tanners' stalls were already closed. The street empty. It was hot, but the man had a black coat thrown over his shoulders. He drew attention to himself. He stopped in front of the old Narkrot Inn, stood there for a moment, listened to the hum of voices, as usual. At this hour, it was full of people. The stranger did not enter the old Narkrot. He pulled his horse further down the street to another tavern, a smaller one, called the Fox. Not enjoying the best of reputations, it was almost empty. The innkeeper raised his head above a barrel of pickled cucumbers and measured the man with his gaze. The outsider, still in his coat, stood stiffly in front of the counter, motionless and silent. What will it be? Beer, said the stranger. His voice was unpleasant. The innkeeper wiped his hands on his canvas apron and filled a chipped earthen tankard. The stranger was not old, but his hair was almost entirely white. Beneath his coat, he wore a leather jerkin laced up at the shoulders and neck. As he took off his coat, those around him noticed that he carried a sword. Not something unusual in itself. Nearly every man in Wisdom carried a weapon, but no one carried a sword strapped to his back as if it was a bow or a quiver. The stranger did not sit at a table with a few other guests. He remained standing at the counter, piercing the innkeeper with his gaze. He drew from the tankard. I'm looking for a room for the night. There is none, grunted the innkeeper, looking at the guest's boots, dusty and dirty. Ask the old Norcrut. I'd rather stay here. There is none. The innkeeper finally recognized the stranger's accent. He was Rivian. I'll pay. The outsider spoke quietly, as if unsure, and the whole nasty affair began. A pockmarked man, beanpole of a man, whom, from the moment the outsider had entered, had not taken his gloomy eyes from him, got up and approached the counter. Two of his companions rose behind him, no more than 2 paces away. There is no room to be had, you Rivian Vandabog, rasped the pockmarked man, standing right next to the outsider. We do not need people like you in Wiseham. This is a decent town. The outsider took his tankard and moved away. He glanced at the keeper, who avoided his eyes. It did not even occur to him to defend the Rivian. After all, who likes Rivians? All Rivians are thieves, the pockmarked man went on, his breath smelling of beer, garlic, and anger. Do you hear me, you bastard? He can't hear you. His ears are full of shit. So one of the men with him, and the second man cackled. Pay and leave, yelled the pocked man. Only now did the Rivian look at him. I'll finish my beer. We'll give you a hand, the pockmarked man hissed. He knocked the tankard from the stranger's hand and simultaneously grabbed him by the shoulder and dug his fingers into the leather strap, which ran diagonally across the outsider's chest. One of the men behind him raised a fist to strike. The outsider curled up on the spot, throwing the pockmarked man off of balance. The sword hissed in its sheath and glistened briefly in the dim light. The place seethed. There was a scream, and one of the few remaining customers tumbled toward the exit. A chair fell with a crash and an earthenware smacked hollowly against the floor. The innkeeper, and his lips trembling, looked at the horrible slashed face of the pocked man who clinging with his fingers to the edge of the counter, was slowly sinking from sight. The other two were lying on the floor, one motionless, the other withering and convulsing in a dark, spreading puddle. A woman's hysterical scream reverberated in the air, piercing the ears of the innkeeper, shuddered, caught his breath, and vomited. The stranger retreated toward the wall, tense and alert. He held the sword in both hands, sweeping the blade through the air. No one moved. Terror, like cold mud, was clear on their faces, paralyzing limbs and blocking throats. 3 guards rushed into the tavern with thuds and clangs. They must have been close by. They had tourniquets wrapped round with leather straps at the ready, but at the sight of the corpses, drew their swords. The Rivian pressed his back against the wall and with his left hand pulled a dagger from his boot. Throw that down, one of the guards yelled with a trembling voice. Throw that down, you thug. You're coming with us. A second guard kicked aside the table between himself and the Rivian. Go get the men, Terska, he shouted to the third guard, who stood near closer to the door. No need, said the stranger, lowering his sword. I'll come by myself. You will go, you son of a bitch, on the end of a rope, yelled the trembling guard. Throw down the sword, or I'll smash your head in. The Rivian straightened. He quickly pinned his blade under his left arm and with his right hand raised towards the guards, swiftly drew a complicated sign in the air. The clout nails which started his tunic from his wrists to elbows flashed. The guards drew back, shielding their faces with their arms. One of the customers sprang up while another darted to the door. The woman screamed again, wild and ear-splitting. I'll come by myself, responded the stranger in his resounding metallic voice. And the 3 of you will go in front of me. Take me to the castellan. I do not know the way. Yes, sir, mumbled the guard, dropping his head. He moved toward the exit, looking around tentatively. The other 2 guards followed him. Out backward, hastily. The stranger followed in their tracks, leaving his sword and dagger. As they passed the tables, the remaining customers hid their faces from the dangerous stranger. Varon, castellan of Wiseham, scratched his chin. He was neither superstitious nor faint-hearted, but he did not relish the thought of being alone with this white-haired man. At last he made up his mind. Leave, he ordered the guards, and you, sit down. No, not there. Further away, if you please. The stranger sat down. He no longer carried a sword or black coat. I am Belrod, castellan of Wiseham, said Belrod, towering with a heavy mace lying on the table, and I am listening. What do you have to say to me, you brigand, before you're thrown into the dungeon? 3 killed with an attempted spell casting. Not bad. Not bad at all. Men are impaled for such things in Wisdom, but I am a just man, so I will listen to you before you are executed. Speak. The Arabian unbuttoned his jerkin and pulled out a wad of white goat leather. You know, this crossways in taverns, he said quietly. Is what we're in here true? Varrod grunted, looking at the runes etched into the leather. So that's it. And I didn't guess at once. Yes, it's true. It's signed by Foltest, King of Temeria, Pontar, and Mahakam. Which makes it true. A proclamation is a proclamation, Witcher. But law is law. And I take care of law and order in Wisdom. I will not allow people to be murdered. Do you understand? The Rivian nodded to show he understood. Belrod snorted with anger. You carry the Witcher's emblem. The stranger reached into his jerkin once more, pulled out a round medallion on a silver chain. It pictured the head of a wolf, buried its fangs. And do you have a name? Any name will do. It is simple to make conversation easier. My name is Geralt. Geralt then, Arivia. I gather from your accent. Arivia. Right. Do you know what, Geralt? This? Geralt slapped the proclamation. Let it go. It's a serious matter. Many have tried and failed already. This, my friend, is not the same as roughing up a couple of scoundrels. I know. This is my job, Geralt. And the proclamation offers 3,000 Orin reward. 3,000, Geralt scowled. And the princess as a wife, or so rumor says. Although gracious Foltest has not proclaimed that. I am not interested in the princess, Geralt said calmly. He was sitting motionlessly, his hands on his knees. Just in the 3,000. What times, sighed the castellan. What foul times. 20 years ago, who would have thought, even in a drunken stupor, that a profession as a witcher would exist? Irate killers of basilisks, traveling slayers of dragons and vodkins. Tell me, Geralt, are you allowed beer in your guild? Certainly. Geralt clapped his hands. Beer, he called, and sit closer, Geralt. What do I care? The beer, when it arrived, was cold and frothy. Foul times, Varald muttered, drinking deep from his tankard. All sorts of filth has sprung up. Mahakam and the mountains is teeming with boogeyman. In the past, it was just wolves howling in the woods, and now it's kobolds and spriggans, wherever you spit, werewolves or some other vermin, fairies and rascals snatching children from villages by the hundreds. We have diseases never heard of before. It makes my hair stand on end. And now, to top it all, this. He pushed the wad of leather back across the table. It's not surprising, Geralt, that your Witcher services are in demand. The King's proclamation, Castellan. Geralt raised his head. Do you know the details? Geralt leaned back in his chair, locked his hands over his stomach. The details? Yes, I know them. Not firsthand, perhaps, but from a good source. That's what I want. If you insist, then listen. Geralt drank some beer and lowered his voice. During the reign of old Madil, his father, when our gracious king was still a prince, Foltest showed us what he was capable of, and he was capable of a great deal. We hoped he would grow out of it, but shortly after his coronation, Foltest surpassed himself jaw-droppingly. He got his own sister with child. Ada was younger, and they were always together, but no one suspected anything except perhaps the queen. To get to the point, suddenly there is Ada with a huge belly, and Foltest talking about getting wed to his sister. The situation was made even more tense because Vesemir of Novigrad wanted his daughter, Dalka, to marry Foltest, and had already sent out his envoys. We had to restrain Foltest from insulting them, and luckily we did, or Vesemir would have torn our insides out. Then, not without Ada's help, for she influenced her brother, we managed to dissuade the boy from a quick wedding. Well, then, Ada gave birth. And now listen, because this is where it all starts. Only a few saw what she bore, but one midwife jumped from the tower window to her death, and the other lost her senses and remained dazed to this day. So I gather that the royal bastard, a girl, was not commonly, and she died immediately. No one was in a hurry to tie the umbilical cord. nor did Ada, to her good fortune, survive the birth. But then Foltest stepped in again. Wisdom dictated that the royal bastard should have been burned or buried in the wilderness. Instead, on the orders of her gracious king, she was laid to rest in a sarcophagus in the vaults beneath the palace. It is not too late for your wisdom now. Geralt raised his head. One of the knowing ones should have been sent for. You mean those charlatans with stars on their hats? Of course. About 10 of them came running later, and when it became known what lay in the sarcophagus, and what scrambled out of it at night, though it did not start manifesting straight away. Oh no. For 7 years after the funeral, there was peace. Then one night, it was a full moon. There were screams in the palace, shouting and commotion. I don't have to tell you, this is your trade, and you've read the proclamation. The infant had grown in the coffin, and how? Grown to have incredible teeth. In a word, she became a striga. Pity you did not see the corpse as I did. Had you, you would have taken a great detour to avoid Wisem. Geralt was silent. Then, as I was saying, Geralt continued, Foltest summoned a whole crowd of sorcerers. They all jabbered at the same time and almost came to blows with those staffs they carry. To beat off dogs, no doubt, once they've been set on loose on them. And I think they regularly are. I'm sorry, Geralt, if you have a different opinion on wizards. No doubt you do in your profession. But to me, they're swindlers and fools. Your witchers inspire greater confidence as men. At least you are more straightforward. Geralt smiled but did not comment. But to the point, the castellan peered into his tankard and poured more beer for himself and the Rivian. Some of the sources of advice did not seem so stupid. One suggests burning the striga together with the palace and the sarcophagus. Another advised chopping off her head. The rest were keen on driving aspen stakes into her body during the day, where the she-devil was asleep in her coffin, worn out by her nightly delights. Unfortunately, one, a jester with a pointed hat and a bald pat, a hunchbacked hermit, argued it was magic. The spell could be undone and the striga could be turned into Foltest's little daughter. As pretty as a picture. Someone simply had to stay in the crypt through the night, and that would be that. After which, can you imagine such a fool? He went into the palace for the night. Little of him was left in the morning, only, I believe, his hat and stick. But Foltest clung to his idea like a burr to a dog's tail. He forbade any attempt to kill the striga and brought in charlatans from all corner of Wisem to reverse the spell and turn her into a princess. What colorful company, twisted women, cripples, doot, and louse-ridden. It was pitiful. They went ahead and cast spells, mainly over Borrel and Tankard. Of course, some were quickly exposed as frauds by Foltest or the council. A few were even hung on the palace steeds, but not enough of them. I would have hung them all. I don't suppose I have to say that the striga, in the meantime, was getting her teeth in all sorts of people, even now and again, and paying no attention to the fraudsters and their spells. Or that Foltest was no longer living in the palace. No one lived there anymore. Bellwood paused, drank some beer, and the witch had waited in silence. This has been here for 7 years. Geralt, because she was born around 14 years ago. We've had a few other worries, like war with Vesemir of Novigrad, fought for real, understandable reasons, over the borders post, not for some princess or marriage alliance. Foltest sporadically hints at marriage and looks over portraits from neighborhood courts, which she then throws down the privy. And every now and then, this man seizes hold of him again, and he sends horsemen out to look for new sorcerers. He promised to reward 3,000 and attracted a number of cranks, stray knights, even a shepherd known throughout the whole region as a cretin. May he rest in peace. But the striga is still doing well. Every now and again, she gets her teeth into someone. You get used to it. At least those heroes trying to reverse the spell have a use. The beast stuffs herself on the spot and doesn't roam beyond her palace. Foltest has a new palace, of course. Quite a fine one. In 7 years, Geralt raised his head. In 7 years, no one has settled the matter? Well, no. Beryl's gaze penetrated the Witcher, because the matter cannot be settled. We have come to terms with it, especially Foltest, our gracious and beloved ruler. Who will keep nailing his proclamations at the crossroads? Although there are fewer volunteers now. There was one recently, but he insisted on the 3,000 in advance, so he put him in a sack and threw him in the lake. There's still no shortage of fraudsters then. No, far from it, the Castellan agreed without taking his eyes off the Witcher. That's why you mustn't demand gold in advance when you go to the palace. If you go. I'll go. It's up to you, but remember my advice. As we're talking of the reward, there has been word recently about the second part of it. I mentioned it to you. The princess for a wife. I don't know who made it up, but if the sugar looks the way they say, then it is an exceptionally grim joke. Nevertheless, there's been no lack of fools racing to the palace for the chance of joining the royal family. To apprentice shoemakers, to be precise. Why are shoemakers so foolish, Geralt? I don't know. And Witchers, Castellan, have they tried? There were a few, but when they heard the spell was to be lifted and the sugar was not to be killed, they mostly shrugged and left. That's one of the reasons why my esteem for Witchers has grown, Geralt. And one came along, younger than you. I forgot his name. If he gave it at all. He tried. And the Fang Princess spread his entrails over a considerable distance. Geralt nodded. That was all of them? There was another one. Geralt remained silent for a while, and the Witcher did not urge him on. Yes, the Castellan said finally. There was one more. At first, when Voltus threatened him with the noose if he killed or harmed the Striga, he laughed and started packing his belongings, but then... Geralt leaned across the table, lowered his voice to almost a whisper. Then he undertook the task. You see, Geralt, there are some wise men in Wisdom, in high positions, who have had enough of this whole affair. Rumor has it, that these men pursued the Witcher in secret, not to fuss around with spells, but to batter the sugar to death until the king's spell had failed, and his dear daughter had been killed in self-defense. An accident at work. The king, of course, would be furious and refuse to pay an Orin in reward, but that would be the end of it. The witty Witcher replied, we could chase Strigas ourselves for nothing. Well, what could we do? We collected money, bargained, but nothing came of it. Geralt raised his eyebrows. Nothing, repeated Veldrod. The Witcher did not want to try the first night. He trudged around, lay in wait, and wandered about the neighborhood. Finally, they say, he saw the Striga in action, as she does not clamber from her crypt just to stretch her legs. He saw her and scampered that night, without a word. Geralt's expression changed a little, and probably was supposed to be a smile. Those wise men, he said, they still have the money, no doubt. Witchers do not take payment in advance. No doubt they still do, said Geralt. Does the rumor say how much they offered? Geralt bared his teeth in a smile. Some say 800. Geralt shook his head. Others muttered the Castellan's talk of 1,000. Not much when you bear in mind that the rumor likes to exaggerate and the king is offering 3,000. Don't forget about the betrothal. Geralt mocked. What are you talking about? It's obvious you won't get the 3,000. How is it obvious? Geralt thumped the table. Geralt, do not spoil my impression of Witchers. This has been going on for more than 7 years. The sugar is finishing up off to 50 people a year. Fewer now. People are avoiding the palace. Oh no, my friend. I believe in magic. I've seen it a great deal, and I believe, to a certain extent, in the ability of wizards and witches. But all this nonsense about lifting the spell was made up by a hunchbacked, snotty old man who'd lost his mind at his hermit's diet. It is nonsense, which no doubt no one but Folstas believes. Ada gave birth to Striga because she slept with her brother. That is the truth. And no spell will help. Now the Striga devours people, as Strigas do, and she has to be killed, and that is that. Listen, 2 years ago, peasants from some godforsaken hole near Mahakam were plagued by a dragon devouring their sheep. They set out together, battered the dragon to death with stanchions, and did not even think it worth boasting about. But we in Wisdom are waiting for a miracle and bolting our doors every full moon. Or tying our criminals to stake in the front of the palace, praying the beast stuffs herself and returns to her sarcophagus. Not a bad method, The butcher smiled. Are there fewer criminals? Not a bit of it. Which way to the palace? The new one. I'll take you there myself. And what about the wise man's suggestion? Castellan, said Geralt. Why act in haste? After all, I could really have an accident at work. Irrespective of my intentions, just in case the wise man should be thinking about how to save me from the king's anger and get those 1,500 orens, of which rumors speak, ready. It was to be 1,000. No, Lord Veldar, the Witcher said categorically. The Witcher who has offered 1,000 ran at the mere sight of a Striga without bargaining. So the risk is greater than 1,000, but it's greater than 1.5 remains to be seen. Of course, I will say goodbye beforehand. Geralt scratched his head. 1,200? No, this is not an easy task. The king is offering 3, and sometimes it's easier to lift a spell than to kill. But one of my predecessors would have done so, or killed the Striga if this were simple. You think they let themselves be devoured out of fear of the king? Then Witcher Geralt nodded wistfully. Our agreement stands, but word of advice, say nothing to the king about danger of an accident at work. Foltest was slim and had a too pretty face. He was under 40, the Witcher thought. The king was sitting on a dwarf armchair carved from black wood, his legs stretched out toward the hearth, where 2 dogs were warming themselves. Next to him on a chest sat an older, powerfully built man with a beard. Behind the king stood another man, richly dressed, with a proud look on his face. A magnet. A Witcher from Rivia, said the king, after the moment's silence fell after Badrill's introduction. Yes, your majesty, Geralt lowered his head. What made your hair so gray? Magic? I can see that you're not old. That is a joke. Say nothing. You've had a fair amount of experience, I dare presume. Yes, your majesty. I'd love to hear about it. Geralt bowed even lower. Your majesty, you know our code of practice forbids us to speak of our work. A convenient code, Witcher. Very convenient. But tell me, have you ever had anything to do with Spriggans? Yes. Vampires and Luscious? Those two. Foltest hesitated. Strigas raised his head. Geralt raised his head and looking the king in the eyes. Yes. Foltest turned his eyes away. Beryl. Yes, gracious majesty. Have you given him the details? Yes, your gracious majesty. He says the spell cast on the princess can be reversed. I've known that for a long time. How, Witcher? Oh, of course, I forgot your code of practice. All right. I'll make one small comment. Several Witchers have been here already, Verald. Have you told him? Good. So I know that your specialty is to kill rather than to reverse spells. This isn't an option. If one hair falls from my daughter's head, your head will be on the block. That is all. Ostrich, Lord Silgan, stay and give him all the information he requires. Witchers always ask a lot of questions. Feed him and let him stay in the palace. He is not to drift from tavern to tavern. The king rose and whistled to his dogs, and made his way to the door, scattering the straw covering the chamber floor. At the door he paused. If you succeed, Witcher, the reward is yours. Maybe I'll add something if you do well. Of course, the nonsense spread by common folk about marrying the princess carries not a word of truth. I'm sure you don't believe I would give my daughter's hand to a stranger. No, Majesty, I do not. Good. That shows you have some wisdom. Foltest left, closing the door behind him. Verald and the magnet, who'd been standing all the while, immediately sat at the table. Castellan finished the king's half-full cup, peered into the jug and cursed. Ostwick, who took Foltest's chair, scowled at the Witcher, while he stroked the carved armrest. Silgan, the bearded man, nodded at Geralt. Do sit, Witcher, do sit. Suppers will soon be served. What would you like to know? Castellan Veldard has probably already told you everything. I know him. He has sooner told you too much than too little. Only a few questions. Ask. The Castellan said that after the Striga's appearance, the king called upon many known ones. That's right. But don't say Striga, say princess. It makes it easier to avoid a mistake in the king's presence and any consequent unpleasantries. Was there anyone else well known among the knowing ones? Anyone famous? There was such, then and later. I don't remember the names. Do you, Lord Ostwick? I do not recall, said the magnate, but I know some of them enjoyed fame and recognition. There was much talk of it. Were they in agreement that the spell could be lifted? They were far from any agreement, Silligan smiled, on any subject. But such an opinion was expressed. It was supposed to be simple, not even require magical abilities. As I understand it, it would suffice for someone to spend the night from sunset to the third cawing of the cock by the sarcophagus. Simple indeed, snorted Velrod. I'd like to hear a description of the princess. Val leapt from his chair. The princess looks like a striga, he yelled. Like the most striggiest striga I have ever heard of. Her Royal Highness, the coursed royal bastard, is 4 cubits high, shaped like a barrel of beer, has a maw which stretches from ear to ear and is full of dagger-like teeth, has red eyes and a red mop of hair. Her paws with claws like a wildcat's hang down to the ground, and surprised me a bit to see her likeness to friendly courts. The princess, plague choker, is already 14. Time to think of giving her hand to a prince in marriage. Hold on, Velred. Ostrich frowned, glancing at the door. Siglin smiled faintly. The description, although vivid, is reasonably accurate. And that's what you wanted, isn't it, Witcher? Varel did not mention that the princess moves with incredible speed and is far stronger for her height and build than one would expect. And she is 14 years old, if that is of any importance. It is, said the Witcher. Do the attacks on people only occur during the full moon? Yes, replied Selgan. If she attacks beyond the old palace, within the palace walls, people always die, irrespective of the moon phases, but she only ventures out during the full moon, and not always then. Has there ever been even one attack during the day? No. Does she always devour her victims? Velrod spat venomly on the straw. Come on, Geralt. It'll be supper soon. Psh. Devours, takes a bite, leaves a side. It varies, according to her mood, no doubt. She only bit the head from one, gutted a couple, and a few more she picked clean to the bone, sucked them dry. You could say, damn mother's... Careful, Verald, snarled Ostrich. Say what you want about the sugar, but do not insult Ada in front of me, as you would not dare in the king's presence. Has anyone she attacked survived? The Witcher asked, apparently paying no special attention to the magnate's outburst. Selgan and Ostrich looked at each other. Yes, said the bearded man. At the very beginning, 7 years ago, she threw herself at 2 soldiers standing guard over the crypt. One escaped. And then, interrupted Bellard, there was another, the miller she attacked near the town, you remember? The following day, later in the evening, the miller was brought to the small chamber above the guardhouse allocated to the Witcher. He was led in by a soldier in a hooded coat. The conversation did not yield any significant results. The miller was terrified. He mumbled and stammered, and his scars told the Witcher more than he did. The striga could open her jaws impressively wide and had extremely sharp teeth, including very long upper fangs, 4 of them, 2 on each side. Her claws were sharper than a wildcat, but less curved. And it was only because of that the miller had managed to tear himself away. Having finished his examination, Geralt nodded to the miller and soldier, dismissing them. The soldier pushed the present through the door and lowered his hood. It was Foltest himself. Sit, do not get up, said the king. This visit is unofficial. Are you happy with the interview? I heard you were at the palace this morning. Yes, your majesty. When will you set about your task? It is 4 days until the full moon. After that. You prefer to have a look at herself beforehand? There is no need. But having had her fill, the princess will be less active. Striga, Master Witcher. Striga. Let's not play at diplomacy. She'll be apprenticed afterward, and that's what I've come to talk about. Answer me unofficially, briefly and clearly. Will it work or not? Do not hide behind your code. Geralt rubbed his brow. I confirm, your majesty, that the spell might be reversed. And, unless I'm mistaken, it can be done by spending the night at the palace. The third cawing of the clock, as long as it catches the striga outside her sarcophagus, will end the spell. That is what is usually done with strigas. So simple. It is not simple. First, you have to survive the night. Then there are exceptions to the rule. For example, not 1 night, but 3 consecutively. There are also cases which are, well, hopeless. Yes, Foltest bristled. I keep hearing that from some people. Kill the monster because it's an incurable case. Master Witcher, I am sure they've already spoken to you. Am I right? Hack the man-eater to death, without any more fuss, at the beginning. And tell the king nothing else could be done. I won't pay, but they will. Very convenient and cheap. Because the king will order the Witcher beheaded or hanged, and the gold will remain in their pockets. The king unconditionally orders the Witcher to be beheaded? Geralt grimaced. Foltest looked the Rivian in the eyes for a long while. The king does not know, he finally said, but the Witcher should bear such an eventuality in mind. Geralt was silent for a moment. I intend to do what's in my power, he said, but if it goes badly, I will defend my life. Your Majesty, you must be prepared for such an eventuality. Foltest got up. You do not understand me. It is obvious you will kill her if it becomes necessary, whether I like it or not. Because otherwise she'll kill you, surely and inevitably. I won't punish anyone who kills her in self-defense, but will not allow her to be killed without trying to save her. There have already been attempts to set fire to the old palace. They shot her with arrows, dug pits, and set traps and snares, until I hung a few of her attackers, but that is not the point. Witcher, listen. I am listening. After the third corner of the clock, there will be no Striga, if I understand correctly. What will there be? If all goes well, a 14-year-old girl with red eyes and crocodile teeth. A normal 14-year-old, except that, well, physically. I see. And mentally, every day a bucket of blood for breakfast, a little girl's thigh. No. Mentally, there is no telling. On the level, I think of a 3 or 4-year-old child. She'll require loving care for a long while. That's obvious. Witcher, I am listening. Can it happen to her again later on? Geralt was silent. Said the king. It can. And what then? Should she die after a long swoon lasting several days, her body will have to be burned quickly. Foltest grew gloomy. I did not think it would come to that, added Geralt. Just to be sure, I'll give you some instructions, Your Majesty, to lessen the danger. Right now? Is it not too soon, Master Witcher? And if right now, interrupted the Rivian. Many things may happen, Your Majesty. It could be that you find a princess in the morning, the spell already broken, and my corpse. Even so, despite my permission to defend yourself, which it seems wasn't that important to you, this is a serious matter, Your Majesty. The risk is great. That is why you must listen. The princess should always wear a sapphire around her neck, or better yet, an inclusion on a silver chain, day and night. What's an inclusion? A sapphire with a pocket of air trapped within the stone. Aside from that, every now and then you should burn juniper, broom, and aspen in the fireplace of her chamber. Foltest grew pensive. I thank you for your advice, Witcher. I will pay heed if, and now listen to me carefully. If you find the case is hopeless, kill her. If you undo the spell but the girl is not normal, if you have a shadow of doubt as to whether you've been entirely successful, kill her. Do not worry, you have nothing to fear from me. I'll shout out you in front of the others, banish you from this palace in the town, nothing more. Of course, I won't give you the reward, but maybe you'll manage to negotiate something from you-know-who. They both were quiet for a while. Geralt, for the first time, Foltest called the Witcher by his name. Yes. How much truth is there that the rumor that the child is as she is because Ada was my sister? Not much. A spell has to be cast, they do not cast themselves. But I think your congression with your sister was the reason the spell was cast, and this is the result. As I thought, that is what some of the knowing ones said, although not all of them, Geralt. Where do such things come from? Spells? Magic? I do not know, Your Majesty. Knowing ones study the causes of such phenomena. For us Witcher, the knowledge that consecrated will can cause such phenomena is enough. That and the knowledge to fight them and kill them, usually. Besides, that is what we're usually paid for. Only a few demand the reversal of spells, Your Majesty. As a rule, people simply want to defend themselves from danger. If the monster has men on its conscience, then revenge can also come into play. The king got up, took a few paces across the chamber, and stopped in front of the Witcher's sword hanging on the wall. With this? He asked, not looking at Geralt. No, that is for men. So I heard. Do you know what, Geralt? I'm going to the crypt with you. Out of the question. Foltest turned, his eyes glinted. Do you know, sorcerer, that I have not seen her, neither after she was born nor later? I was afraid. I may never see her. Am I not right? At least I have the right to see my daughter while you're murdering her. I repeat, it is out of the question. It is certain death, for me as well as you. If my tension, my will falters, no, Your Majesty. Foltest turned away, started toward the door. For a moment, Geralt thought he would leave without a word, without a parting gesture, but the king stopped and looked at him. You inspire trust, he said, although I know what a rogue you are. I was told what happened at the tavern. I am sure you killed those thugs, solely for word to spread, to shock people, to shock me. It is obvious that you could have dealt with them without killing. I'm afraid I'll never know whether you're going there to save my daughter or to kill her. But I have to agree to it. I have to agree. Do you know why? Geralt did not reply. Because I think, said the king, I think she is suffering. Am I not right? The Witcher fixed his penetrating gaze on the king. He did not confirm it, did not nod, did not make the slightest gesture. But Foltest knew. He knew the answer. Geralt looked at the palace window. For the last time, dusk was falling rapidly. Beyond the lake, with distant lights of Wyzem twinkled, there was a wilderness around the old palace, a strip of no man's land with which, over 70 years, the town had cut itself off from this dangerous place, leaving nothing but a few ruined, rotting beams and the remains of a gap-toothed palisade, which had obviously not been worth dismantling and moving. As far away as possible, as at the opposite end of the settlement, the king had built his new residence. The stout tower of his new palace loomed black in the distance against the darkening blue of the sky. In one of the empty, plundered chambers, the Witcher returned to the dusty table at which he was preparing, calmly and meticulously. He knew he had plenty of time. The sugar would not leave her crypt before midnight. On the table in front of him, he had a small chest with metal fittings. He opened it. Inside, packed tightly into compartments lined with dried glass, stood small vials of dark glass. The Witcher removed 3. From the floor, he picked up an oblong packet thickly shaped and wrapped in sheepskin and fastened with leather straps. He unwrapped it, pulled out a sword with an elaborate hilt and a black shiny scarab covered with rows of runic signs and symbols. He drew the blade, which lit up with a pure shine of mirror-like brightness. It was pure silver. Geralt whispered an invocation and drank, one after the other, the contents of 2 vials, placing his left hand on the blade of the sword after each sip. Then, wrapping himself tightly in his black cloak, he sat down on the floor. There were no chairs in this chamber or in the rest of the palace. He sat motionless, his eyes closed. His breathing, at first even, suddenly quickened, becoming rasping and tense, and then stopped completely. The mixture which helped the Witcher fully gain full control of his body was chiefly made up of Ventrum, Strontium, Hawthorn, and Spurg. The other ingredients had no name in any human language. For anyone who was not, like Geralt, endured it from childhood, it would have been a lethal poison. The Witcher turned his head abruptly. In the silence, his hearing sharpened beyond measure. Easily picked up a rustle of footsteps through the courtyard, overgrown with stinging nettles. It could not be the Striga. The steps were too light. Geralt threw his sword across his back. hid his bundle in the hearth of the ruined chimney place, and silent as a bat, ran downstairs. It was still light enough in the courtyard for the approaching man to see the Witcher's face. The man, Ostrich, backed away abruptly, an involuntary grimace of terror and repulsion contorted his lips. The Witcher smiled wryly. He knew what he looked like. After drinking a mixture of Bainswort, Monkshood, and Eyebright, the face takes on the color of chalk, and the pupils fill the entire iris. But the mixture enables one to see in the deepest darkness, and that's what Geralt wanted. Ostrich quickly regained control. "You look as if you were already a corpse butcher," he said. "From fear, no doubt. Don't be afraid. I bring you reprieve." The Witcher did not reply. "Do you not hear what I say, you Rivian charlatan? You're saved and rich." Ostrich hefted a sizable purse in his hand and threw it at Geralt's feet. 1,000 Orions. "Take it and get on your horse and get out of here." The Rivian said nothing. "Don't gawp at me," Ostrich raised his voice, "and don't waste my time. I have no intention of standing here until midnight. Do you understand? I do not wish you to undo the spell. No, you haven't guessed. I am not in league with Ballard and Siglin. I do not want you to kill her. You're simply to leave. Everything is to stay as it is." The Witcher did not move. He did not want the magnet to know, to realize how fast his movements and reactions now were. It was quickly growing dark, a relief, as even in the semi-darkness of dusk was too bright for his dilated pupils. "And why, sir? Is everything to remain as it is?" he asked, trying to enunciate each word slowly. "Now that," Ostrich raised his head proudly, "should really be of damn little concern to you." "Now, and what if I already know?" "Go on." "It'll be easier to remove Voltus from the throne if the sugar frightens people even more. If the royal madness completely disgusts both magnates and common folk, am I right? I came here by way of Redanian and Novigrad. There is much talk that there are those in Wisdom who look to King Vesemir as their savior and true monarch, but I, Lord Ostrich, do not care about politics, or the successions to thrones, or revolutions and palaces. I am here to accomplish my task. Have you never had a sense of responsibility and plain honesty and professional ethics? Careful to whom you speak, you vagabond, Ostrich yelled furiously, placing his hand on the hilt of his sword. I've had enough of this. I am not accustomed to hold such discussions. Look at you. Ethics, codes of practice, morality. Who are you to talk? A brigand who barely arrived before he starts murdering men? Who bends double to Fortest and behind his back bargains with Balrog like a hired thug? And you dare to turn your nose up at me, you serf? Play at being a knowing one? A magician, you scheming Witcher. Be gone before I run the flat of my sword across your gob. The Witcher did not stir. He stood calmly. You better leave, Lord Ostrich. He said, it's growing dark. Ostrich took a step back, drew his sword in a flash. You asked for this, you sorcerer. I will kill you. Your tricks won't help you. I carry a turtle stone. Geralt smiled. The reputation of a turtle stone was mistaken as it was popular, but the Witcher was not going to lose his strength on spells, much less expose his silver sword to contact with Ostrich's blade. He dived under the whirling blade, and with the heel of his hand and his silver stuffed cuff, hit him in the temple. Ostrich quickly regained consciousness and looked around. In the total darkness, he noticed that he was tied up. He did not see Geralt standing right beside him, but he realized where he was and let out a prolonged, terrifying howl. Keep quiet, said the Witcher. Otherwise you'll lure her out before her time. You damn murderer, where are you? Untie me immediately, you louse. You'll hang for this, you son of a bitch. Quiet. Ostrich panted heavily. You lead me here to be devoured by her. Tied up, he asked, quieter now, whispering a vile incentive. No, said the Witcher. I'll let you go, but not now. You scoundrel, hissed Ostrich to distract the Striga. Yes. Ostrich did not say anything. He stopped wiggling and lay quiet. Witcher? Yes? It's true that I wanted to overpull protest. I'm not the only one, but I am the only one who wanted him dead. I wanted him to die in agony, to go mad, to rot alive. Do you know why? Geralt remained silent. I loved Ada, the king's sister, the king's mistress, the king's trollop. I loved her. Witcher, are you there? I am. I know what you're thinking. But it wasn't like that, believe me. I did not cast any spells. I did not know anything about magic. Only once in Aegir did I say, only once, Witcher. Are you listening? I am. It's his mother. The old queen. It must be her. She couldn't watch him and Ada. It wasn't me. I only once, tried to persuade them, but Ada, Witcher. I was besotted and said, Witcher, was it me? Me? It doesn't matter anymore. Witcher, is it nearly midnight? It's close. Let me go. Give me more time. No. Osric did not hear the scrape of the tomb lid being moved. Aside what the Witcher did, he leaned down over and with his dagger cut the magnet's bonds. Osric did not wait for a word. He jumped up, numb, hobbled clumsily, and ran. His eyes had grown accustomed enough to the darkness for him to see his way from the main hall to the exit. The slab blocking the entrance to the crypt opened and fell to the floor with a thud. Geralt, prudently behind the staircase, Baslid saw the misshapen figure of the Striga speeding swiftly and nearly in the direction of Ostric's receding footsteps. Not the slightest sound issued from the Striga. A terrible, quivering, frenzied scream tore through the night, shook the old walls, continued rising and falling, vibrating. The Witcher could not make out exactly how far away it was. His sharpened hearing deceived him, but he knew the Striga had caught up with Ostric quickly, too quickly. He stepped into the middle of the hall, stood right at the entrance to the crypt. He threw down his coat, twitched his shoulders, adjusted the position of his sword, pulled out his gauntlets. He still had some time. He knew that the Striga, although well fed after the last full moon, was not readily abandoning Ostric's corpse. The heart and liver were, for her, valuable reserves of nutrients for the long periods spent in lethargic sleep. The Witcher waited. By his count, there was about 3 hours left until dawn. The cock's crow could only mislead him. Besides, there was no cocks in this neighborhood. He heard her. She was trudging slowly, shuffling along the floor, and then he saw her. The description had been accurate. The disproportionately large head sat on a short neck, were surrounded by tangled, curly halo of reddish hair. Her eyes showed in the darkness like an animal's. The Striga stood motionless, her gaze fixed on Geralt. Suddenly, she opened her jaws, as if proud of her rows of pointed white teeth, then snapped them shut with a crack like a chest being closed, and leapt, slashing at the Witcher with her bloodied claws. Geralt jumped to the side, spun at a swift pirouette. The Striga rubbed against him, also spun around, slicing through the air with her talons. She did not lose her balance and attacked anew. Mid-spin, gnashing her teeth, fractions away from Geralt's chest. The Rivian jumped away, changing the direction of his spin with a fluttering pirouette to confuse the Striga. As he leapt, he dealt his hard blow to the side of her head with the silver spikes studding the knuckles of his gauntlet. The Striga roared horribly, filling the palace with a booming echo, fell to the ground, froze, and started to howl. Howlily and furiously. And the Witcher smiled maliciously. His first attempt, as he had hoped, had gone well. Silver was fatal to the Striga, as it was for most monsters brought into existence through magic. So there was a chance. The beasts were like the others, and that bode well for lifting the spell. While Silver would, as a last resort, assure his life, the Striga was in no hurry with her next attack. She approached slowly, baring her fangs, dribbling repulsively. Geralt backed away and carefully placed his foot, traced a semicircle. By slowly and quickening his movements, he distracted the Striga, making it difficult for her to leap. As he watched, the silver unwound a long, strong silver chain weighted at the end. The moment the Striga tensed and leapt, the chain whistled through the air and, coiling like a snake, twined itself around the monster soldier's neck and head. The Striga's jump became a tumble, and she let an ear-piercing whistle. She thrashed around on the floor, howling horribly with a fury, or from the burning pain inflicted by this despised metal. Geralt was content. If he wanted, he could kill the Striga without great difficulty. But the Witcher did not draw his sword. Without noting, and the Striga's behavior had given him reason to think she might be Nothing in the Striga's behavior had given him reason to think she might be an incurable case. Geralt moved to a safer distance and, without letting the withering shape on the floor out of his sight, breathed deeply, focused himself. The chain snapped. The silver links scattered like rain in all directions, raining against the stone. The Striga, blind with fury, tumbled to attack, roaring. Geralt waited calmly, and with his raised right hand, traced the sign of Ada in front of him. The Striga fell back as if hit by a mallet, but kept her feet. Extended talons bared her fangs. Her hair stood on end, and it fluttered as she was walking across a great fierce wind. With difficulty, one rasping step at a time, she slowly advanced. But she did advance. Geralt grew uneasy. He did not expect such a simple sign to paralyze the Striga entirely, but neither did he expect the beast to overcome it so easily. He could not hold the sign for long. It was too exhausting, and the Striga had no more than 10 steps to go. He lowered the sign suddenly and sprang aside. The Striga, taken by surprise, flew forward, lost her balance, fell, slid along the floor, and tumbled down the stairs into the crypt's entrance, yawning in the floor. An infernal scream reverberated from below. To gain time, Geralt jumped to the stairs leading to the gallery. He had not even climbed halfway up when the Striga ran out of the crypt, speeding along like an enormous black spider. The Witcher waited until she ran up the stairs after him, then leapt over the balustrade. The Striga turned on the stairs, sprang, and flew at him at an amazing 10-meter leap. She did not let herself be deceived by his pirouettes this time. Twice her talons left their mark on the Rivian's leather tunic. But another desperately hard blow from the silver-spiked gauntlet through the Striga's side shook her. Geralt, feeling fury building inside him, swayed, bent backward, and with a mighty kick, knocked the beast off her legs. The roar she gave was louder than all the previous ones. Even the plaster crumbled from the ceiling. The Striga sprang up, shaking with an uncontrollable rage and lust for murder. Geralt waited. He drew his sword, traced circles with it in the air, and skirted the Striga, taking care that the movement of his sword was not in rhythm with his steps. The Striga did not jump. She approached slowly, following the bright streak of the blade with her eyes. Geralt stopped abruptly, froze with his sword raised. The Striga, disconcerted, also stopped. The Witcher traced a slow semicircle with the blade, took a step in the Striga's direction, then another. Then he leapt, feigning a whirling movement with the sword above her head. The Striga curled up, retreated in a zigzag. Geralt was close again, the blade shimmering in his hand. His eyes lit up with an ominous glow. A hoarse roar tore through his clenched teeth. The Striga backed away, pushed by the power of concentrated hatred, anger, and violence which emanated from an attacking man, and struck her in waves penetrating her mind and body. Terrified and pained by feelings unknown to her, she let out a thin, shaking squeak, turned on the spot, and ran off in a desperate, crazy escape down the dark tangle of the palace's corridors. Geralt stood quivering in the middle of the hall, alone. It had taken a long time. He thought before this dance on the edge of an abyss, this mad, macabre ballet of a fight had achieved the desired effect, allowing him to physically become one with his opponent, to reach the underlayers of concentrated will which permeated the Striga, the evil, twisted will from which the Striga was born. The Striga shivered at the memory of taking on that evil to redirect it, as if in a mirror against the monster. Never before had he come across this concentration of hatred and murderous frenzy, not even from basilisks who enjoyed a ferocious reputation from it. All the better, he thought, as he walked towards the crypt entrance and the blackness that spread from it like an enormous puddle. All the better, all the stronger, was the blow received by the Striga. This would give him a little bit more time until the priest recovered from the shock. The Witcher doubted whether he could repeat such an effort. The elixirs were weakening, and it was still a long time until dawn. But the Striga could not return to her crypt before first light, or all his troubles had come to nothing. He went down the stairs. The crypt was not large. There was room for 3 stone sarcophagi. The slab covering the first one was half pushed aside. Geralt pulled the 3rd vial from beneath his tunic, quickly drank its contents, climbed in the tomb, and stretched out into it. As he expected, it was a double tomb for mother and daughter. He'd only just pulled the cover closed when he heard the Striga's roar again. He lay on his back next to Ada's mummified corpse and traced the sign of Yidden on the inside of the slab. He laid a sword on his chest, stood a tiny hourglass filled with frostbite sand next to it, and crossed his arms. He no longer heard the Striga's screams as she searched the palace. He gradually stopped hearing anything as the true love and Catelyn began to work. When Geralt opened his eyes, the sand had passed through the hourglass, which meant his sleep had been longer than he intended. He picked up his ears and heard nothing. His senses were now functioning normally. He took a hold of his sword and, murmuring an incantation, ran his hand across the lid of the sarcophagus. He then moved the slab slightly, a couple of inches. Silence. He pushed the lid further, sat up holding his weapon at the ready, and lifted his head above the tomb. The crypt was dark, but the Witcher knew the outside dawn was breaking. He struck a light, lit a miniature lamp, and lifted it, throwing a strange shadow across the crypt. It was walls of the crypt. It was empty. He scrambled from the sarcophagus, aching, numb, cold. And then he saw her. She was lying on her back next to the tomb, naked and unconscious. She was rather ugly, slim, with small pointed breasts, and dirty. Her hair, flaxen red, almost reached to her waist. Standing the lamp on the slab, he knelt beside her and leaned over. Her lips were pale, her face was bloody where he had hit her cheekbone. Geralt removed his gloves, put his sword aside, and without a fuss drew her top lip with his fingers. Her teeth were normal. He reached for her hand, which were buried in her tangle hair. Before he took it, he saw her eyes open. Too late. She swiped him across the neck where her talons cutting deeply. She howled, striking him in the eyes with her other hand. He fell on her, grabbing her by the wrist, nailing her to the floor. She gnashed her teeth, which were now too short, in front of his face. He butted her in the face with his forehead, pinning her down harder. She lost her former strength. She could only wither beneath him, howling, spitting out blood, his blood, which was pouring into her mouth. His blood was draining quickly. There was no time. The Witcher cursed, bit her hard on the neck, just below the ear. He dug his teeth in and clenched them until her inhuman howling became a thin, desperate scream, and then a choking sob, the cry of a hurt 14-year-old girl. He let her go when she stopped moving, got to his knees, tore a piece of canvas from his sleeve pocket, and pressed it to his neck. He felt for a sword, held the blade against the unconscious girl's throat, and leaned over her hand. The nails were dirty, broken, bloody, but normal, completely normal. The Witcher got up with difficulty. The sticky wet grayness of early morning was flooding through the crypt's entrance. He made a move toward the stairs, but staggered and sat down heavily on the floor. Blood was pouring through the drenched canvas in his hand, running down his sleeve. His unfastened tunic slit his shirt, tore and ripped rags from it, and tied it around the neck, knowing that he did not have much time and that he would soon faint. He succeeded and fainted. And wizened beyond the lake, a cock ruffling his feathers in the cold damp cawed hoarsely for the 3rd time. He saw the whitened walls and beamed ceilings of the small chamber above the guard room. He moved his head, grimacing with pain, and moaned. His neck was bandaged thickly, though professionally. Lie still, Witcher, said Harold. Why do not move? My sword. Yes, yes, of course. What is most important is your Witcher's silver sword. It's here, don't worry. Both the sword and your little trunk. And the 3,000 orns. Yes, yes, do not utter word. It is I, who am an old fool, and you, the wise Witcher. Foltest has been repeating it over and over for the last 2 days. 2. Oh yes, 2. She slit your neck open quite thoroughly. One could see everything you had inside there. You lost a great deal of blood. Fortunately, we hurried to the palace straight after the third crowing of the cock. Nobody slept in Wiseland that night. It was impossible. You made a terrible noise. Does my talking tire you? The princess is like a princess, thin and somewhat dull-witted. She weeps incessantly and wets her bed, but Foltest says that will change. I don't think it will change for the worst. Do you, Geralt? The Witcher closed his eyes. Good. I'll take my leave now. Rest. Beryl got up. Geralt, before I go, tell me, why did you try to bite her to death, Geralt? The Witcher was asleep.